I'm basically asking a very simple question. Can this community adapt to the demands of the changing environment within which it operates? We have an ecosystem that is changing. It's multi-stakeholder. It has many actors, public, private donors, and yet the pace of change that we are seeing is accelerating and is in many ways creating a dynamic, complex system that is difficult for each of you, for all of us to make a difference. And we as U.S. nonprofits are trying to wrestle with this external environment, a panoply of actors, many of whom have very different assumptions as to why they are doing what they are doing. And our challenge with our individual missions is, can we develop some form of common agenda? Because there is a basic reality that we cannot achieve the things that we want to do as individual organizations without each other, without building the relationships, the partnerships. And we find that our resource generation is less about proposals and fundraising and more where do we fit with other actors in a very complex environment. So can we adapt and be part of this changing environment? And in many ways, the ground is shifting under the feet of our community. And the problem is it's not one force at play, but many forces. And we had a panel with the U.S. government, and to complicate matters, the U.S. government is shifting its own approaches. They too want to engage with new and non-traditional actors. And the fact that our government is approaching and exploring partnerships with many different groups is good for development, is good for the engagement of our country in the world. That they are doing so often without tapping the knowledge and the deep relationships that exist in our community is a problem. And it is a challenge that we have to wrestle with. But the focus of the plenary today is not on government, but rather on the many private actors, the center of our community, the private actors who shape what we do. And I think the challenge here is that many groups do not understand the role of what we call an NGO, a U.S. nonprofit. We remain a major partner of traditional donors and funders, but we are also a donor. The interaction community in 2009 raised $8.9 billion of private resources from the American people, which makes us a large donor around the world. And we are experts. We bring large technical skill sets, whether it's a mainstreaming of gender programs or helping global health systems in a nation state reach its poorest people. We are a long-time partner with local civil society. We recognize that we are part of civil society, a piece of it that inherently has a solidarity obligation with local civil society, and last but not least, we have a track record of delivering results. And increasingly, we must figure out how to deliver these results in a framework of monitoring evaluation that looks at not just how we deliver services, but how we work with others. And as I mentioned, yet the role of the U.S. NGO is often misunderstood. And our community has not yet mastered the relationships, building the skill set, the trust, the flexibility needed to leverage multiple actors. And how do we engage them? There are so many. You know, just to mention a few, we have the private sector and corporations that play a critical role. And again, an interesting statistic, in the past 40 years, if you look at development assistance as a percentage of the overall flow of U.S. resources going around the world, a point 40 years ago, development assistance was 74.8% of the resources that this country generated. And it has moved to 13% of the resources going into the developing world, while private capital flows have risen from 25.1% to 87% of the flow of resources going in. It is a fundamental transformation of the flow of resources and the role that we must play with those. Whether it's foreign direct investment, remittances, corporate social responsibility, we have to figure out how we impact these flows, and particularly as corporations look at value partnerships and not just charitable relationships. And we have a ways to go, both in terms of trust and our capacity to leverage the private sector. And then just to complicate matters, we have social investors and social impact entrepreneurs and individuals that are blurring the lines and the nature of what is business. And we are not the center of that universe. It will involve billions of dollars of flows in new ways of having a difference on the ground, and I do believe the NGO community has a role to play. And we tend to traditionally focus on our own government. There are other actors out there, as we all know, whether it's the BRICS or engaging South-South cooperation, the fact that Turkey was a major part of humanitarian assistance in the Horn of Africa. And at the heart of all of this, and perhaps the biggest challenge we face is actually one of the successes of our community. We have been working for decades to make sure that local voices are heard and that local institutions are at the heart of the development, the humanitarian work, or the human rights work that we do around the world. Those voices are now increasingly and are demanding to be heard, and we have to figure out how we relate to them. We are no longer the dominant voice out there. And the world has tried to adapt to this changing framework. For the past 15 years, there's been a discussion, a debate about development aid effectiveness, a concept of how do we fit all these actors together, and this sort of culminated in the high-level forum on aid effectiveness in Busan, South Korea last December. And the challenge that came together here was not what do we do about this change, it was more how do we accelerate this change? How do we base the work that we do as institutions on a broadly recognized consensus that this is about country ownership, it is about societal ownership in their own betterment and their own development process. And I think the challenge for us is we have a few implications for our sector, and I just want to mention four. The traditional international NGO service delivery model is evolving. It doesn't mean that we haven't been involved in capacity building or resiliency efforts, but our basic model is evolving, and we need to figure out how best to evolve it. We cannot do the work we do without engaging multiple stakeholders and figuring out how best to leverage other actors. And it was interesting, there was a global compact at the UN looking at corporations. I think they interviewed some 766 corporate CEOs around the world, 100 countries, 25 industries. 78% of them believed that it was central to their business to involve and get involved in multiple stakeholder engagement around development goals. It is not as if we are somehow welcoming the private sector into this space. This is also the private sector's space, and our challenge is to figure out our relationship. And third, perhaps most importantly, how do we engage and include civil society, the voices of the most marginalized, not as translators of those voices, but as amplifiers of those voices? We have a unique responsibility as a long-term partner of civil society to ensure that those voices are heard. And as institutions with decades of experience working with local groups, we need to make sure that this PS and civil society was consulted was not just an afterthought. So can we adapt to this changing environment? Yes. In many ways we already have. In many ways we are driving this change. But the implications for our institutions may be profound. But the reality is neither government nor the private sector alone can improve human well-being, and we certainly can't do it alone. But prosperity requires a vibrant, dynamic civil society playing an advocacy role, but very much involved in service delivery. And perhaps by recognizing that not only is it difficult, but that the only way to achieve the goals we want to achieve is by doing it together, that we will put in the hard work to make all of this possible. Thank you.